The sun hadn't yet cleared the Hindu Kush when Staff Sergeant Daniel Moss felt the first rounds hit the HESCO barriers. The sound was unmistakable. AK-47 fire, close, too close. He'd been awake for 20 minutes, heating water for instant coffee in the operations center, when the world exploded. Keating sat at the bottom of a valley, surrounded on three sides by mountains that rose like the walls of a natural amphitheater. Military analysts would later call the positioning tactically indefensible. The soldiers who lived there had a simpler term, the fishbowl. Every ridge, every tree-line, every boulder formation above them was a potential firing position. The Taliban owned the high ground. They always had. Moss grabbed his plate carrier and sprinted toward the southern wall. The base was barely 3 acres, a collection of plywood huts, sandbag bunkers, and razor wire perched beside the Landaisen River. 53 American soldiers, 1 Afghan National Army platoon, and now, from the sound of it, several hundred Taliban fighters closing in from every direction. Contact! Contact north, someone screamed over the radio. Then south, then east, then west. The attack had been coordinated, perfectly timed. Moss knew immediately this wasn't a probe. This was an overrun attempt. He reached the M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun, mounted on the southern defensive position, just as Specialist Kyle Jenkins was climbing into the turret. Jenkins was 22, from Oklahoma. With a handlebar mustache, he'd grown to look older. He'd been in country for 7 months. They're coming up the road. Jenkins shouted, pointing toward the valley access route, a dirt track that wound to the riverbed and connected Keating to the outside world. Through the pre-dawn haze, Moss could see them. Headlights, multiple vehicles, moving fast. Get the TOC on comms, Moss ordered, slamming a belt of ammunition into the M2. Tell them we need air support now. But the radios were already screaming with overlapping transmissions. The command post was under direct fire. The mortar pit had taken an RPG hit. The northern observation post, Opie Fritchie, was cut off, surrounded, fighting for survival on a ridgeline a kilometer away. The Taliban had planned this down to the minute. Jenkins worked the radio while Moss scanned the valley through the gun's iron sights. The first technical truck, a Toyota Hilux with a Pecan machine gun welded to bed, rounded the bend doing 40 miles per hour. Behind it, another, then another. Moss counted 6 before he stopped counting. "They're suicide trucks," Jenkins said, his voice tight. "They're going to ram the gate." Moss had seen this tactic before, during the Korengal deployment. Load a truck with fighters and explosives, drive it straight into a checkpoint, detonate on impact. The resulting breach will let the assault wave pour through. "Get off the gun," Moss said quietly. Jenkins looked at him. "What?" "Get off the gun." "Sarge, I can—" "That's an order, Jenkins. Get to the TOC. Help coordinate the defense." Jenkins hesitated, then climbed down. He knew what Moss wasn't saying. Someone had to stay on that gun, and whoever did probably wasn't coming back. The southern position was the most exposed point on the perimeter. No cover, no concealment, just a swivel-mounted .50 cal and sandbags that wouldn't stop a determined rifle round. Moss climbed into the turret. The first truck was 300 meters out. He pressed his thumbs against the butterfly trigger. The M2 roared to life. The Browning M2 is not a subtle weapon. Designed in 1918, refined through a century of warfare, it fires a .50 BMG round, half an inch in diameter, traveling at 2,900 feet per second. When it hits soft targets, it doesn't wound. It disintegrates. Moss walked his fire across the lead truck's windshield. The glass shattered. The driver slumped. The vehicle veered left, clipped a boulder, and flipped 3 times before slamming into the riverbank. Fighters spilled out, some crawling, some motionless. Second truck. Moss adjusted, leading the target. Burst, burst, burst. The engine block exploded in a geyser of steam and oil. The truck rolled to a stop, blocking the road. But they kept coming. Third truck swerved around the wreckage, accelerating. Moss could see the faces now. Young men, beards, wrapped in paycalls and chest rigs, some firing AKs one-handed out the windows. The truck bed was packed with fighters and what looked like yellow jerrycans. Fuel. Explosives. Maybe both. Moss held the trigger down. The tracers arced through the dawn like fireflies. The trucks had peeled back like aluminum foil. Then the payload ignited. The explosion was a physical force, a wall of heat and pressure that slammed into the outpost. Moss felt the shock wave in his chest, tasted copper and smoke. When his vision cleared, the truck was gone. In its place, a crater and burning debris scattered across 50 meters. But the mountain was lighting up. Every ridge, every tree lean, every position above the outpost erupted in muzzle flashes. PKM machine guns, RPGs, mortars. The Taliban had prepositioned fighters in a 360-degree kill zone. They were firing down into the base with impunity. Rounds zipped past Moss's head. One hit the turret shield with a metallic ping. Another tore through his left shoulder plate, spinning him sideways. He grunted, reset his stance, kept firing. Fourth truck. Fifth. Sixth. The valley became an inferno. Moss's hands were numb from a vibration. His ears were bleeding from the concussive blasts. The M2 was glowing cherry red, heat waves shimmering off the barrel. He could smell his own uniform burning where hot brass was piling up around his boots. And still he didn't stop, because if he stopped, the trucks would reach the gate. If they reached the gate, the base would fall. If the base fell, 53 Americans would die in a valley no one had ever heard of, in a war that felt like it would never end. So Daniel Moss, 31 years old, father of two, from a town in Oregon with one stoplight, made a choice. He stayed on the gun, in the Tactical Operations Center. First Lieutenant Aaron Caldwell was fighting his own war. The Plywood Command Post had taken 3 direct RPG hits. One wall was gone. Smoke filled the interior. Computer screens flickered, then died. The radio was a chaos of voices. Wounded soldiers calling for medevac. Squad leaders requesting ammunition. Observation posts reporting they were being overrun. Caldwell was 25, West Point class of 2006, on his second deployment. He'd arrived at Keating 3 weeks earlier to take command of Bravo Troop, 3rd Squadron, 61st Cavalry Regiment. The outpost was scheduled to be shut down. Too isolated. Too vulnerable. The closure had been delayed for logistical reasons. Now, 200 Taliban fighters were trying to make sure it closed permanently. "Sir, we've lost contact with Opie Fritchie," the radio man shouted over the gunfire. Last transmission said they're down to small arms and taking casualties. "What's our air support status?" "Apache gunships inbound from Jalalabad. ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes. In combat, that was a lifetime. What about the southern position?" Caldwell asked. Moss was still on the gun. He stopped at least 8 trucks, but he's taking heavy fire. "I don't know how long." An explosion rocked the building. Dust rained from the ceiling. When Caldwell's ears stopped ringing, he could hear something new. Small arms fire inside the perimeter. The Taliban had breached the wire. "Get everyone to fallback positions," Caldwell ordered. "Prepare to defend the Tilsea. If they take this building, we lose command and control." But even as he said it, Caldwell knew the real fight was happening at the southern wall. As long as Moss kept that gun firing, the main assault couldn't push through. The moment it went silent, the base would be overrun in minutes. He grabbed a headset. "Moss, this is Caldwell. What's your status?" "Static." "Then, still here, sir. Guns running hot. I've got maybe 3 trucks left on the road. They're backing off. We've got air support inbound. 15 minutes. Can you hold?" A long pause. Caldwell could hear the M2 firing in the background, punctuated by explosions. "Roger that, sir. I can hold." The transmission cut out. Caldwell stared at the radio. He'd served with Moss for 11 months. Knew he had 2 daughters, 7 and 9. Knew his wife taught elementary school back in Oregon. Knew Moss had enlisted after September 11th, turning down a promotion to stay with his platoon. And now Caldwell was asking him to stay exposed in a kill zone for 15 more minutes. "Sir," the radio man said, We're getting reports of fighters inside the perimeter. They're moving toward the ammunition depot. Caldwell made his decision. Everyone not essential to communications. Grab a weapon. We're going out there. Moss didn't know how much time had passed. Could have been minutes. Could have been hours. The world had compressed into a simple rhythm. Acquire target. Fire. Adjust. Acquire target. Fire. Adjust. His shoulder was dislocated. He could feel the joint grinding wrong, but his hands kept working the gun. Truck 7 exploded in a fireball that lit up the valley like noon. Truck 8 took a burst through the cab and careened into the river. Truck 9, 10, 11, all burning now, black smoke rising in columns against the dawn sky. He was aware distantly that he'd been hit multiple times. His left arm wasn't responding properly. Something warm was running down his side. His vision was narrowing, edges going dark. But the 12th truck was still coming. This one was different, bigger, looked like a jingle truck, one of the ornate Pakistani commercial vehicles, painted in bright colors and covered in chains and bells. But there was nothing festive about it now. The windshield was reinforced. The driver wasn't swerving or slowing. And the bed was piled high with what Moss recognized immediately as homemade explosives, fertilizer bombs wrapped in det cord. This was the end game, the final push. If that truck reached the gate, the explosion would level half the outpost. Moss's hands were shaking. He couldn't feel his legs. The M2's barrel was so hot, he could see it warping slightly. If he fired much longer, the gun would literally melt. He aimed for the engine block and held down the trigger. The first burst went high. Moss adjusted, fighting to control the recoil with one functional arm. Second burst. Third. Rounds sparked off the reinforced windshield but didn't penetrate. The truck was 100 meters out. 75. 50. Moss could see the driver now. Young guy, maybe 18, eyes wide, mouth moving in prayer or a war cry. Behind him, through the cab window, Moss saw the payload. Stacks and stacks of yellow jugs, wired together, surrounded by nails and ball bearings for shrapnel. 25 meters. The M2 clicked empty. Out of ammunition. For the first time in 4 minutes, the gun went silent. Moss looked down at the belt feed. No more cans. He'd fired everything. The truck accelerated toward the gate. And then, from somewhere behind him, Moss heard a voice. Move! Specialist Jenkins appeared out of nowhere, carrying a fresh ammo, like it weighed nothing. He slammed it into place, yanked the charging handle, and without a word, took over the gun. The M2 roared back to life. Jenkins walked the fire down from the windshield to the hood to the front axle. The tire exploded. The truck lurched sideways, losing momentum. Jenkins kept firing. The engine block shattered. Steam erupted. The truck was still rolling, but slower now, drifting off course. 15 meters from the gate, it stopped. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened. A young man stepped out, one hand clutching his side where blood was spreading, the other holding something small and dark, a detonator. Moss tried to shout a warning, but his voice wouldn't work. The man raised the detonator. Jenkins fired one last burst. The man fell. The detonator hit the ground. And nothing happened. Either the wiring had been damaged in the shooting, or the detonation sequence required a specific trigger action. Either way, the truck sat there, silent, smoking, packed with enough explosives to kill everyone in the outpost. Behind them, someone was screaming for an EOD team. Jenkins finally released the trigger. He looked at Moss, who was slumped against the turret, barely conscious. "You're insane, Sarge," Jenkins said quietly. Moss tried to smile. Tasted blood. "Yeah, probably." Then he heard it. The beautiful, unmistakable sound of rotors. Apache gunships, diving into the valley. 30mm chain guns already spinning up. The cavalry had arrived. The battle for COP Keating wasn't over. But the southern wall had held. 12 trucks. For minutes. One gun. When the medics finally pulled Moss out of the turret 20 minutes later, his hands were still locked around the M2's grips. They had to pry his fingers off one at a time. Daniel Moss woke to fluorescent lights and the antiseptic smell of a field hospital. His entire body felt like it had been hit by a truck, which, in a way, it had, or at least by the fragments of 12 trucks exploding in sequence. Easy, Sergeant. Don't try to move. The voice belonged to Captain Rachel Zimmer, a trauma surgeon from Seattle who'd been deployed to Bagram for 8 months. She was checking his vitals, her face professionally neutral, but Moss caught something in her eyes. Concern, maybe surprise that he was alive. How bad? Moss's voice came out as a rasp. 4 gunshot wounds, 2 through and through, 2 extracted. Multiple shrapnel injuries. 2nd-degree burns on your hands and forearms. Dislocated shoulder we've already reset. Perforated eardrum. Severe dehydration. And probably a concussion, though you refuse to stop firing long enough for us to diagnose it properly. She paused. You should be dead, Sergeant. The others? Zimmer's expression shifted. 8 Kia. 27 wounded. Could have been a lot worse. The Apache crew said when they arrived, they saw 12 burning vehicles in front of the southern position. They couldn't believe one gunner did that. Moss closed his eyes. 8 dead. He knew most of them, had shared meals with them, played poker, complained about the mail delays. Young guys, most of them. Kids who'd never make it home. Jenkins, he asked. Specialist Jenkins is fine. Minor shrapnel wounds. He's been here 3 times asking about you. Zimmer made a note on her tablet. He said you ordered him off the gun. Said if you hadn't, he'd be dead. He came back. Brought ammo when I ran dry. Kids saved the outpost. From what I hear, you both did. Zimmer checked the 4 line running into Moss's arm. You're being evacuated to Landstuhl in Germany tomorrow. From there, probably Walter Reed. Your war's over, Sergeant. Moss stared at the ceiling tiles. His war was over. 3 deployments. 7 years since he'd enlisted in the aftermath of 9/11, and it ended in a valley he'd never heard of before being assigned there. Ended with 12 burning trucks and 8 friends who wouldn't see their families again. There's someone here to see you, Zimmer said, if you're up for it. Before Moss could answer, a man in a crisp ACU uniform entered. Colonel Marcus Denton, 3rd Squadron Commander, mid-40s, ramrod straight, with the kind of presence that made you stand at attention even when you were horizontal in a hospital bed. As you were, Sergeant, Denton said, though Moss hadn't moved. He pulled up a chair. How are you feeling? Like I got shot 4 times, sir. A thin smile. Accurate assessment. Denton opened a folder. I've been reviewing the after-action reports from Keating, reading the SIGINT intercepts, watching the drone footage. He looked up. I wanted to hear it from you. What were you thinking when you stayed on that gun? Moss considered the question. What had he been thinking? Honestly, he couldn't remember thinking much at all. Just doing. Just acting on instinct and training. And something else he didn't have a word for. Wasn't really thinking, sir. Just knew if those trucks got through, everyone was dead. Seemed simple. Simple. Denton shook his head. Sergeant, I've been doing this for 23 years. I've seen courage. I've seen heroism. What you did... He paused. The Taliban radio chatter. They were telling each other you wouldn't leave the gun. They concentrated fire on your position. Over 300 rounds within a 10-meter radius of that turret. You stayed exposed for 4 minutes in a kill zone, took multiple hits, and kept firing. That's not simple. That's something else entirely. Moss didn't know what to say to that. You're being recommended for the Medal of Honor, Denton continued. The paperwork's already in motion. You'll probably get it downgraded to a Distinguished Service Cross or Silver Star. You know how these things work politically, but you deserve the recognition. Jenkins deserves it too, sir. He came back with the ammo. Without him, Jenkins is getting a Bronze Star with Valor. I made sure of that. Denton leaned forward. But we both know what happened out there. You held that position alone for most of the fight. You stopped an organized assault by a numerically superior force. You saved 53 American lives. That's not something I can put in a report that captures what it really means. Moss looked at his bandaged hands. They were shaking slightly. Shock, probably, or the lingering adrenaline. or the realization that he'd come within seconds of dying in a place that didn't matter to anyone except the people who'd been there. "Sir, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why were we there?" "At Keating, I mean. Everyone knew it was indefensible. We'd been scheduled to close it down for months. Why were we still sitting in that valley?" Denton was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "You know I can't give you a complete answer to that. Operational security. Strategic considerations. But between you and me," he glanced at the door, then back. "Sometimes in war, the mission and the reality don't align. Keating should have been abandoned 2 years ago. But there were concerns about perception, about appearing to retreat, about political optics back home. So soldiers stayed in a valley that couldn't be defended, because closing it would have been seen as weakness. 8 men died for optics. 8 men died holding their ground against overwhelming odds. Don't let the bureaucratic failures diminish what you all did. The fight matters, even when the reasons for it are complicated." Moss wasn't sure he believed that, but he didn't have the energy to argue. Denton stood. "Get some rest, Sergeant. You've got a long recovery ahead. And when you get home, take care of those daughters of yours. They're lucky to have a father like you." After Denton left, Moss lay in the hospital bed, listening to sounds of the base outside, helicopters landing, trucks rumbling past, the rhythmic pulse of a war that would continue long after he left. He thought about the young man who'd stepped out of the 12th truck, bleeding, holding a detonator. Thought about how young he'd looked. 18, maybe younger. Someone's son. Probably someone's brother. A kid who'd been told he was fighting for something sacred, who'd driven a truck full of explosives toward a gate, ready to die for a cause he believed in, just like Moss had been ready to die at that gun. The similarity made him uncomfortable. Both of them in a valley, both willing to sacrifice everything, both believing they were on the right side. War had a way of making everyone think they were the heroes of their own story. His hand found the call button. When a nurse appeared, he asked for something to help him sleep. He didn't want to think anymore. The October 3rd assault on combat outpost Keating represents one of the most sophisticated Taliban operations of the Afghan campaign. Intelligence suggests the attack was planned for at least 6 months, with fighters infiltrating the region from Pakistan and prepositioning weapons caches on the surrounding ridgelines. The use of vehicle-borne IEDs bides in a coordinated assault pattern represents an evolution in Taliban tactics, likely influenced by operations observed in Iraq during 2006 to 2007. The failure of the assault can be attributed to 3 primary factors. 1. Unexpectedly effective defensive fire from the southern position. 2. Structural failure of the final VBID detonation system. 3. Timely arrival of Apache air support. Had any of these factors been absent, the outpost would likely have been overrun, resulting in mass casualties and a significant propaganda victory for Taliban forces. Recommendation: accelerate closure of vulnerable outposts in Kunar and Nuristan provinces. The strategic value of these positions does not justify the risk to personnel. Commander Das Muhammad sat in a room lit by a single kerosene lamp, listening to his surviving fighters describe the battle. They spoke quietly, reverently, like men who'd witnessed something terrible and inexplicable. He would not leave. One fighter kept repeating, "We concentrated our fire. We hit him. We saw him hit." But he would not leave the gun. Das Muhammad was 43, a veteran of the Soviet War, a man who'd fought Americans for 8 years across these mountains. He'd planned the Keating assault himself, coordinating with 3 other commanders, assembling fighters from 6 provinces. It should have worked. By every tactical calculation, it should have worked. They'd killed 8 Americans, wounded 27 more, destroyed significant infrastructure, but they'd failed to overrun the base. And the cost had been devastating. 63 fighters dead, including some of his best men. The 12 trucks, loaded with carefully hoarded explosives, were nothing but wreckage, all because of one American who refused to die. What was his name? Das Muhammad asked. The fighters looked at each other. None of them knew. "Find out," Das Muhammad said. "I want to know the name of the man who held the southern wall." One of the younger fighters, barely 18, spoke up. "Why, Commander?" Das Muhammad stared into the lamp's flame. Because in war, you must know your enemies, especially the brave ones. They are the most dangerous. Later that night, Das Muhammad wrote a report for his commanders across the border in Pakistan. He described the assault, the casualties, the lessons learned. But he left out the part about the American gunner. Some things were hard to explain to people who hadn't been there. In war, courage was universal. It appeared on both sides, in forms that complicated the narratives everyone wanted to believe. The Americans thought they were fighting for freedom and democracy. The Taliban believed they were defending their homeland against invaders. And in the middle of those grand narratives, individual men made split-second decisions that changed everything. Das Muhammad had met brave Americans before, Rangers who'd fought to the last round in Takurgar, Special Forces soldiers who'd refused to surrender in the Korengal. But something about the Keating gunner bothered him, the sheer stubbornness of it, the refusal to accept death even when it was inevitable. It reminded him, uncomfortably, of himself at 23, fighting Russians in these same valleys. Reminded him of the choices young men make when they believe in something larger than themselves. He blew out the lamp and tried to sleep. Outside, the mountains stood silent and indifferent, as they always had, as they always would. Men came and fought and died in these valleys. The mountains remained. The war would continue. It always did. Specialist Kyle Jenkins stood in the hallway outside Moss's room, trying to work up the courage to go inside. He'd been standing there for 10 minutes. The thing was, he wasn't sure what to say. Thank you? Sorry? Both seemed inadequate. Moss had ordered him off the gun, had effectively told him, I'll die so you don't have to. That kind of sacrifice didn't have an appropriate response in the handbook. You couldn't just shake someone's hand and say, thanks for almost dying in my place. The door opened. A nurse came out, saw Jenkins, gave him a knowing look. He's awake. You should go in. Jenkins entered. Moss was sitting up, looking better than he had at Bagram, but still pretty rough. Bandages everywhere. His left arm in a sling. But his eyes were clear. Hey, Sarge. Jenkins, you didn't have to come all the way to Germany. Yeah, I did. Jenkins pulled up a chair. I needed to tell you. He stopped, frustrated. I'm not good at this. You brought me ammo, Moss said simply. That's all that needs to be said. You ordered me off the gun. You were going to die on that turret, so I wouldn't. That's what NCOs do. We keep our soldiers alive. That's not. Jenkins shook his head. That's not normal. That was suicide. You know it was suicide. Moss was quiet for a moment. Maybe, but it was also the only choice that made sense in that moment. Sometimes in combat, the options are bad and worse. I chose bad. If I'd chosen worse, you and 50 other guys would be dead. So now I get to live with knowing someone almost died for me. No, Moss said firmly. Now you get to live. Period. That's the whole point, Jenkins. You go home. You see your family. You do something meaningful with the life you've got. You don't waste it feeling guilty about surviving. Jenkins felt something tight in his chest. I came back with the ammo because I couldn't leave you there. You understand that, right? I wasn't being brave. I just couldn't. I couldn't let you die alone. I know, and that's why you're going to be a good NCO someday. You understand what matters. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, a transport plane roared overhead, carrying more wounded soldiers to better medical facilities, carrying dead soldiers home to their families. What are you going to do? Jenkins asked. After you recover, Moss looked at his bandaged hands. Go home. See my daughters. Figure out how to be a regular person again. He paused. Maybe teach high school, coach football, or something. Try to remember what normal life looks like. You think you can? Go back to normal after this. Honestly? No idea. But I've got to try. The war took enough from me. I'm not giving it the rest of my life, too. Jenkins nodded. He understood that. The war took and took and took. It was up to you to decide when to stop giving. For what it's worth, Jenkins said, what you did out there, that's going to be a story people tell for a long time. The gunner who held the wall. 12 burning trucks. For minutes, People need to hear about stuff like that. Moss smiled sadly. You know what I hope? I hope nobody needs to hear about it. I hope we stop putting soldiers in valleys like Keating. I hope we figure out a better way to do this than sacrificing kids in places that don't matter. But it did matter. You saved 53 lives. Yeah, and 8 guys died anyway. That math doesn't balance out, Jenkins. It never does. After Jenkins left, Moss lay back and stared at the ceiling. The doctors said he'd make a full recovery. Physically, at least. The psychological stuff, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the guilt, that would take longer, maybe forever. He thought about what he'd told Jenkins about going home and being normal. He'd meant it when he said it. But now, alone in a hospital room in Germany, thousands of miles from Oregon and even further from Afghanistan, he wondered if normal was even possible anymore, because part of him was still in that turret, would always be in that turret. Hands on the gun, watching trucks approach, making the calculation over and over. If I die here, they live. If I die here, they live. It was the kind of thought that changed you permanently, made you understand something fundamental about what you were capable of for better or worse, made you realize that when it came down to it, you were willing to trade your life for others without hesitation. Most people never learn that about themselves. Moss almost wished he hadn't, but he had. And now he'd have to figure out how to live with that knowledge for the next 40 or 50 years, assuming he got that long. Outside, another plane landed. More wounded. More soldiers whose wars had ended in ways they'd never expected. The machine kept running, regardless of the cost. That's what machines did. Daniel Moss closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Tomorrow he'd start physical therapy. Next week, maybe they'd transfer him stateside. Eventually, he'd go home. But part of him would always be in that valley, on that gun, making a choice that shouldn't have been necessary. That's what war did. It took pieces of you and left them in places you could never return to. You went on living, but you were never quite whole again. The doctors called it recovery. Moss had other words for it, but he kept those to himself. Major Sarah Chun had been analyzing Afghan combat reports for 3 years, and the Battle of COP Keating had all the markers of something she'd been tracking for months, a pattern of attacks on isolated outposts that suggested Taliban tactical evolution far beyond what most analysts acknowledged. She stood in front of a wall-sized digital map in the secure planning room, pointing out positions to Colonel Lawrence Dietrich, her section chief. Red pins marked attacks. Yellow pins marked plan closures. The overlap was disturbing. Look at the timeline, sir, Chin said, pulling up a spreadsheet. Wanted. Attack June 2008, 9 Kia. Bella. Attack May 2009, 1 Kia. Ranch House. Abandoned after months of sustained attacks. And now Keating. 8 Kia would have been much worse if not for one gun holding the line. Dietrich studied the map. He was 56, a veteran of Desert Storm and the early Afghanistan deployment, with a reputation for listening to junior officers even when their conclusions were uncomfortable. What's your assessment, Major? Sir, they're not just attacking us randomly. They're targeting outposts they know we're planning to close. They've either penetrated our decision-making process through HUMIT, or they're reading the same tactical assessments we are and reaching the same conclusions about which positions are vulnerable. You're suggesting they have intelligence on our closure timeline? I'm suggesting they don't need it. These outposts are indefensible by basic military logic. We know it. They know it. The difference is we're moving bureaucratically slowly to close them, and they're exploiting the gap. Chin clicked through a series of drone reconnaissance photos. Keating sits at the bottom of a valley with 3 sides exposed. The tactical assessment recommended closure in 2007. It's now 2009, and we had 53 soldiers sitting in a kill box waiting for approval to evacuate. 8 of them died for that delay. Dietrich's expression was grim. You understand what you're implying? That we're putting soldiers at risk for political optics? That closure equals retreat in the media narrative? I understand it, sir, but the soldiers don't care about optics. They care about whether the mission they're dying for makes sense. And does it make sense? Chin hesitated. This was the question that could end her career if she answered honestly. But she'd spent 3 years watching red pins accumulate on maps, reading casualty reports, interviewing survivors. She'd earned the right to her assessment. No, sir. These outposts were established during the hearts and minds phase, when the strategy was to maintain a presence in every valley to show commitment to local populations. But the strategy changed. Now we're focused on major population centers and counterterrorism operations. These isolated cops don't serve the current mission. They're just targets. Dietrich sat down heavily. You want me to take this up the chain? Recommend we accelerate closures. I want you to tell them what we're paying for indecision. 8 men at Keating. 9 at Wanted. More coming if we don't act. Chin pulled up a photo. Staff Sergeant Daniel Moss in the hospital, bandaged and unconscious. This man held off an entire Taliban assault column with a machine gun because we left him in an indefensible position. He almost died doing our job for us, making the hard tactical decisions we should have made years ago. I've read the reports. What he did was extraordinary. What he did was necessary because of our failures, sir. And we're going to put a medal on him and send him home and keep putting other soldiers in the same situation until the bureaucracy catches up with reality. Dietrich stood, walked the map, stared at the red pins. You know what happens if I take this to the Joint Chiefs? They'll ask me to quantify the political cost of appearing to retreat. They'll run models on public perception. They'll debate whether closing these outposts hurts our negotiating position with Kabul. And while they're debating, more soldiers will die in valleys that don't matter. So what do? We document everything. Every assessment, every casualty, every preventable death. We build a case so airtight they can't ignore it. And when the next attack happens, because there will be a next attack, we're ready to show them exactly how predictable it was. Chin nodded. It was the answer she'd expected. Not satisfying, but realistic. The military was good at fighting wars. It was less good at stopping ones that should have ended. There's something else, sir. Chun pulled up a classified NSA intercept. Taliban radio traffic from the Keating assault. This one's disturbing. Dietrich read the translation. The American on the gun will not leave. We have hit him many times. He continues firing. Brothers, he will not leave. They're talking about Moss, Chin said. But look at the tone. It's not just tactical reporting. There's something else. Respect, maybe, even fear. They concentrated massive fire on his position because they couldn't understand why he wouldn't retreat. What's your point? My point is that on some level, both sides recognize courage when they see it, even if they're trying to kill each other. Moss became something symbolic in that moment, not just to us, but to them, a representation of why this war keeps going. Because both sides have men willing to die in valleys that ultimately don't matter to anyone except the people fighting there. Dietrich was quiet. Then, did you know they're pushing for him to get the Medal of Honor? I heard. He deserves it. Maybe, but you know what happens when we give out medals like that? We turn tragic tactical failures into heroic narratives. We make it easier to justify leaving the next group of soldiers in the next indefensible valley because, look, heroism can triumph over bad planning. Chin hadn't thought about it that way. So we shouldn't recognize what he did. No, we absolutely should. But we also can't let the heroism obscure the systemic failure that made it necessary. Moss shouldn't have been in that position. None of them should have. How do we prevent it from happening again? That's the question, Major. And the answer is probably a lot more complicated than either of us wants to admit. Daniel Moss sat in a wheelchair in the psychiatric evaluation office, filling out his 4th assessment form of the week. The questions were all variations on a theme. How often do you experience nightmares? Do you feel detached from others? Do you have difficulty sleeping? Do you experience sudden anger or irritability? He checked boxes mostly at random. What was he supposed to say? That every time he closed his eyes, he saw the young man with the detonator? That he couldn't sleep more than 2 hours without waking in a cold sweat? Convinced he was back in the turret? That normal conversation felt bizarre and distant, like he was watching himself through glass? Yeah, that would go over well. Captain David Restrepo, The staff psychologist sat across from him, reviewing the forms with a practiced, neutral expression. He was maybe 40, with gray at his temples and the kind of calm demeanor that came from years of listening to soldiers describe their demons. "You're doing well physically," Restrepo said. "The surgeons are pleased with your recovery, but I'm more concerned about this." He tapped the evaluation forms. "You're showing classic PTSD symptoms, Sergeant. Nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbing. This is treatable, but only if you engage with the treatment." "I'm fine," Moss said automatically. "Are you?" "Because from where I'm sitting, you look like a man who's still in Afghanistan even though his body's in Maryland." Moss didn't respond. Restrepo leaned forward. "Let me tell you what I see in your file. 3 deployments, multiple combat actions, consistent performance under pressure, a good NCO, well-liked by his soldiers, respected by command. And then in October, you spent 4 minutes in a position where you statistically should have died. You made a conscious choice to stay exposed in a kill zone, knowing the likely outcome. That's not bravery, Sergeant. That's suicide with purpose. I saved lives." "You did, unquestionably. But the decision to stay on that gun wasn't just tactical. It was existential. You chose to die so others would live. And now you're having trouble processing the fact that you survived." Moss looked at the floor. He hated how perceptive Restrepo was. Hated how accurately he'd identified the central problem. Moss had made peace with dying in that turret. He'd accepted it, embraced it even. The sacrifice made sense. It was clean and clear and purposeful. But then he'd survived, and now he was left with all the trauma of dying, without the resolution of actually being dead. "What am I supposed to do?" Moss asked quietly. "Go home and pretend everything's normal? Coach Little League and go to PDA meetings and act like I didn't spend 4 minutes killing people in a valley on the other side of the world?" "No," Restrepo said. "You're supposed to acknowledge that what you experienced was traumatic, that it changed you, that you're allowed to struggle with it. And then you're supposed to do the hard work of integrating that experience into your life instead of pretending it didn't happen. And if I can't, then you'll spend the rest of your life as a ghost, Sergeant, physically present but emotionally absent, and your wife and daughters will lose you just as completely as if you died on that turret." Moss felt something crack inside his chest. His daughters, Emma, 9 years old, who loved soccer and hated broccoli, Sophie, 7, who was learning piano and wanted to be a veterinarian. He'd barely thought about them in Afghanistan. It was too painful, too distracting. But they were waiting for him in Oregon, expecting their dad to come home. Except the dad who came home wouldn't be the same person who left. "How do I?" Moss started, then stopped. "How do I explain to them what I did? How do I tell them their father stayed on a gun and killed people because it was the only choice that made sense?" "You don't. Not yet, anyway. They're too young to understand the moral complexity. What you tell them is that you did your job, that you protected your friends, that you made hard choices in a difficult situation. The details can wait until they're older. And my wife, that's harder. She'll know something's different. She'll see the nightmares, the distance, the ways you've changed. Your job is to let her in. Don't shut her out because you think she can't handle it. Trust that the woman who married you is strong enough to help you carry this." Moss nodded slowly. It made sense in theory. In practice, he had no idea how to do it. "There's something else we need to discuss," Restrepo said. "You're being considered for the Medal of Honor. That's an incredible recognition, but also comes with challenges. Media attention, public appearances. People want to hear the story over and over. It can be overwhelming, especially when you're already struggling with PTSD. I don't want a medal. I believe you, but you're getting one anyway, even if it's downgraded to a silver star. And when you do, you're going to become a symbol, the heroic gunner who held the line. That's not who you are. That's a narrative constructed by people who need heroes. Your job is to remember the difference. What if I can't? Then come back here, and we'll work through it. But Sergeant, you need to understand, you're not unique. Thousands of soldiers are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan with the same struggles. The same nightmares. The same sense that the world back home doesn't make sense anymore. You're not alone in this. Doesn't feel that way. I know, but that's the isolation talking. The trauma convincing you that no one can understand. Part of recovery is pushing back against that lie. After the session, Moss wheeled himself to the hospital's outdoor courtyard. It was a cold October day, leaves falling from the trees, the sky gray and heavy with approaching rain. He watched a group of wounded soldiers, missing limbs, burned scars, the visible casualties of war, helping each other navigate the grounds. They were laughing about something, making jokes, finding moments of normalcy in the wreckage of what they'd lost. Maybe that's what recovery looked like. Not going back to who you were, but building something new from the pieces that remained. Moss's phone buzzed. A text from his wife, Jennifer. Emma got an A on her science project. She wants to tell you all about it. When can we video call? He stared at the message. His daughter, excited about a science project. The most normal thing in the world. A world that felt impossibly distant from the turret in Kiener Province. But it was his world. The one he'd almost died to get back to. He typed a response. Tomorrow morning. I want to hear everything. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A small step toward reconnecting with the life he'd left behind. The life that was waiting for him to figure out how to live it again. In the distance, thunder rumbled. The rain was coming. Moss didn't move. He let it come, let it soak through his hospital clothes. Let it remind him that he was still here, still alive, still capable of feeling something other than gunfire and explosions. It would have to be enough. For now, it would have to be enough. Following comprehensive review of recent attacks on isolated combat outposts in Regional Command East, approval is hereby granted to accelerate closure timeline for COP Keating, COP Lowell, COP Marga, and 14 additional positions deemed tactically indefensible under current operational parameters. Closures to be completed by December 31st, 2009. This decision is not to be characterized as strategic retreat, but rather as tactical reallocation of assets to more defensible and strategically relevant positions. Public affairs guidance will emphasize operational flexibility and evolving mission parameters rather than acknowledging defensive vulnerabilities. The house looked exactly the same, white with blue trim, Christmas lights strung along the gutters. Daniel Moss stood on the sidewalk, duffel bag in hand, staring at the place he'd called home for 6 years. It should have felt welcoming. Instead, it felt alien. Jennifer waited on the porch, wrapped in a cardigan. 7 months since he deployed. 53 days since the battle. He felt like an imposter, wearing the skin of the man who'd left. Emma and Sophie exploded through the door, talking at once, reaching for him. He caught them, breathing in their shampoo, their reality. Inside, everything was aggressively, painfully normal. Cinnamon pine Christmas ornaments, volcano science projects, jingle bells on piano. That night, after the girls slept, Jennifer finally asked, "You seem different." "I am different. I killed people," Moss said quietly. "In 4 minutes, I destroyed 12 trucks full of fighters. I watched them burn. There was a kid at the end, maybe 18, with a detonator. You saved 53 lives," Jennifer said. 8 died anyway. He paused. "I can't stop thinking about it. They were just people, young guys who thought they were doing the right thing, just like me. Then we figure out who you are now. Together. Around 0300 hours. The nightmare came. The gun jammed. Trucks kept coming. The base exploded. Everyone died because he failed. Jennifer's hand on his back. You're home. You're safe." The silver star sat heavy against his chest, downgraded from a Medal of Honor. Too many uncomfortable questions about indefensible positions. Moss gave the approved version to reporters. Saw the threat. Stayed on the gun. Did what any soldier would do. Heroes didn't have PTSD. The narrative required simplicity. Kyle Jenkins found him after the ceremony. Bronze star visible on his own chest. "How you holding up? Good days and bad days." Liar. They watched young soldiers march past, still deploying to a war with no end. "Think we made a difference?" Jenkins asked. "The valley's still there. Taliban are still there. Keating got shut down 3 weeks after we left. Moss paused, but 53 guys went home to their families. Maybe that's enough. Stevens didn't make it, Jenkins said quietly. Suicide. 2 months ago. Another casualty. Another soldier who couldn't survive the war inside his head. That could have been me. That's why we keep checking in. Keep reminding each other there's still something worth sticking around for. I'm glad I'm still here, Moss said. First time he'd meant it. Commander Das Muhammad stood in the abandoned outpost, studying the turret where the American had made his stand. Bullet-scarred metal, shredded sandbags, blood-stained ground. His fighters had claimed victory when the Americans evacuated, but Das Muhammad knew better. They'd made a tactical decision. The whole battle, 63 fighters dead, 12 trucks destroyed, had been for nothing. The Americans had already decided to leave. All that sacrifice, all that courage, for a valley neither side truly needed. Somewhere in America, the gunner was receiving awards, being called a hero, and he probably was. Courage was courage, regardless of flag. But heroism in service of flawed strategy was still just young men dying for decisions made by old men who'd never see the valleys where blood was spilled. Das Muhammad had been fighting for 30 years. Against Soviets, warlords, Americans, the mountains remained unchanged, indifferent to the names and flags that passed through. He walked away, leaving the valley to its ghosts, American and Afghan alike. 6-month home. Nightmares less frequent. Therapy helping. Slowly, the silver star in a drawer, rarely seen. Daniel Moss sat on the porch watching Emma and Sophie play soccer. Jennifer handed him a beer. Just thinking how strange normal life is, he said. I keep thinking about the kid with the detonator. How young he was. A whole life we ended in a second. You're going to carry it for the rest of your life, Jennifer said. The question is whether you let it destroy you or teach you something. Emma kicked the ball toward him. Come play with us, Dad. Moss stood, jogged into the yard. For the next hour, he was just a father playing soccer. Not a soldier. Not a hero. Just Daniel Moss, trying to be present in the life he'd almost died to preserve. The sun set slowly. Oregon mountains turned purple. Somewhere, the war continued. But here, there was just grass and laughter and 3 people who loved each other. It wasn't redemption. Wasn't closure, but it was life. Messy, complicated, occasionally beautiful life. And Daniel Moss was still here to live it. That would have to be enough. The Battle of COP Keating exposed significant systemic failures. Key findings. Tactically indefensible positions should be abandoned immediately, not maintained for political optics. Individual heroism cannot substitute for sound strategic planning. Staff Sergeant Daniel Moss received the Silver Star for extraordinary heroism. 8 soldiers received posthumous awards. 53 survived. Final note, the courage displayed was remarkable. The necessity of that courage represents a failure of leadership at multiple levels. We must do better.